Hello friends, I'm Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane. Welcome back to the Paradigm Quilt Sew Along. We are now on week 2 of making our Paradigm quilt tops together. If you are new here or just finding this video, make sure you check out this video first where we will go over the week 1 details. We are taking 5 weeks together to make the Paradigm quilt. So by now you should have your Paradigm pattern either as a printed copy or a PDF is fine too, and your fabrics for making your Paradigm quilt top. So I will be using these fabrics right here and I am really excited to dive in. This week we will be prepping our fabrics, cutting our fabrics, and also making the corner units. I hope by now you might have read through the entire Paradigm pattern. If you haven't done that yet, make sure you do before we start cutting. Reading through the entire pattern first helps you know where we're heading. So go ahead and read through the whole pattern, and also maybe find the section about corner units because that's what we're going to start sewing this week. Before we dive into this week of the sew along, I want to share with you our sponsor. Our sponsor this week is Stella Lighting, and the prize is this really cool task lamp. It's called the Stella 2. And it is super bright and really fantastic. I use it all the time. There's also brightness settings where you can turn it down or turn it up, and then you can also make it more blue light or more of like a warm color as well. So it's a really great lamp and I'm really excited to get to give one away to one lucky winner. If you want to be entered to win a prize this week, just make sure to post a photo of your progress with hashtag ParadigmSAL over on Instagram. Using that hashtag on your post is what helps me know that you are participating each week. I will be announcing this week's winner in the email that I send out next week. So if you're not officially signed up for the sew along, make sure you do that. I have a link in the description down below for you to find the blog post about the sew along as well as a link to sign up, and that'll get you on the email list for little email reminders. All right, now that we covered our prize information, let's go ahead and get started this week. I'd like to start off by saying that not every quilter presses their fabric before cutting, but I personally recommend it and I do it for every single quilt. So go ahead and lay your fabric out on your ironing board, and I also use Best Press in a spray bottle. And what I will do while I wait for the iron to finish heating up is just spritz the fabric. And I like to spritz a little bit heavier where the creases are. If your fabric's been folded, then you'll have creases in it, and I'd like to make sure that we get those creases out. But I do like a nice thin layer of Best Press all over the fabric. And then we'll take our nice hot iron and press it, and the heat from the iron will dry the Best Press and get all of those wrinkles out of your fabric. When you've finished one section, just go ahead and move your fabric over and do the next section. When you're done prepping one fabric, go ahead and set it aside, and we'll go ahead and grab some of our other colors. I'm just gonna prep all of my fabrics and then I'll get ready to cut them. When you are ready to start cutting out your fabrics, you will need a couple key supplies. I'm using a large cutting mat, a rotary cutter like this one. I really recommend using a fresh blade if you haven't changed your rotary blade in a while. And then of course quilting rulers. So quilting rulers come in a variety of sizes, and you're going to want to look at the cutting instructions in your Paradigm pattern to see which size quilt you're making and what size the pieces need to be. But you'll notice for the throw size, we cut out some pretty large pieces. So I have this giant ruler, or you can use other smaller rulers or a combination of 2 smaller rulers. I want to show you one trick that I do sometimes is put 2 rulers next to each other as I'm cutting, and that gives me measurement across. So that's one way to do it. It is kind of tricky because they can shift. You might consider taping them together. If you want to do that, just make sure that the lines are lined up. So lots of different options with the rulers. or your cutting mat probably has measurements on it as well. So you'll notice as I'm cutting, I'm actually going to use the measurements on the cutting mat pretty heavily. When I'm doing smaller pieces, I tend to not really pay attention to the cutting mat. But when I'm doing pieces that are large, like on the throw size, you're going to want to pay attention to the grid as well to use that as a ruler. As you're getting ready to cut, you can decide what order you want to cut your fabrics in. I'm actually going to cut colors 3 and 4, which are both piece D. I'm going to cut those at the same time on top of each other because it's going to save me time, and that's one of the easier cuts to do. I like to save background for last because that tends to be the most complicated or the most cuts. So I'll do the easier ones first to kind of get the hang of it, and then I'll start in on the background. Alright, so I'm going to grab colors 3 and 4 from my stack and line them up. And I'm going to start off by lining up the raw edges on one side and then paying attention to the selvages and the folded area. And I'm going to start off by getting a nice clean cut on one end. So I'll just take a long straight ruler, place it so that I'm cutting off just a tiny bit of all 4 layers. Make sure that you line up the dots of a ruler or one line with the folded edge, and then also check to make sure that that's even with the selvage. And that's how you'll make sure that your cut is also straight. So press down on your ruler, open your rotary cutter, and press into the mat to cut. So I just cut off a tiny little sliver and I can throw that away. And then I'm going to rotate these fabrics, keeping them stacked on top of each other because I'm cutting 2 colors at once. And I'm gonna line these up with the 0 line on my cutting mat. So go ahead and line it up at the line, and then again checking to make sure that you have a straight line across the fold and a straight line across the selvage. And then go ahead and cut. The leftover fabrics can just go into your scrap stash. And then now we are going to cut it into squares. So I'm going to rotate it one more time, and this time I'm going to cut off the selvage. So I'm going to want to make sure that I get those nice and lined up. Now, because we are cutting it into a square, I'm going to pay attention to the dotted edge, line it up, and then cut. And those selvages can be saved for a selvage project if you use your selvage scraps for anything like that. And now we have one more cut to make this into a square. So now I'm gonna line up that edge that I just cut off with my 0 marker. Make sure it's straight and even, and then do your final cut to make it a square. And you'll see I have some more scraps that I can save for later, for another little project maybe. And we have 4 piece D squares. So I have the 2 for color 3 and the 2 for color 4. Next I'm gonna cut out color number 2. We are gonna follow the same process for color number 2. I just wanted to change my angle up a little bit so you could watch it from a different direction. So first things first, I'm gonna cut a straight edge off the end of my fabric. So I got that edge straight. We're cutting 2 squares, and because the fabric is folded, that works out well. And now there are 2 different options here. I have a nice big ruler that would work, or I could do the same process that I did with the other ones where I use the lines on the cutting mat. So I'm gonna line the fabric up with line 0, grab my straight ruler and line it up. Now that we have our 2 sides of our squares, now we just have to trim off the selvage and trim the other one. So for these, I'm gonna go ahead and use my ruler, and then I flip it around and trim it here. And I will say for color 2, feel free to cut it a smidge generous. If you wanted it to be a little bit bigger, it's not gonna hurt anything. So color 2 is done, and now we're gonna move on to color 1. And now this is where you do wanna be a little extra careful. So I'm basically gonna use one side of my fabric for the 4 F squares, and then the other side of the fold is going to be my 1 A square. So what I'm gonna do, instead of just cutting 4 F squares this way, I'm going to cut it so that I could do 2 in 1. And I'm gonna cut that big piece first. All right, so now that we have this into a more manageable size, the reason I had such a big piece was because that is color 1 and binding for this quilt. So I'm gonna unfold it, and now we're just cutting 1 layer. And I'm gonna start by cutting off the selvage. And then I'm gonna cut to make piece A. And then you'll see we do have to trim this down just a tiny bit because piece A is a little smaller than 2 of piece F. So I'm gonna trim that down now. I'm just cutting off a 1/2 inch. So there's my 1 piece A square. And now I'm gonna use the rest of my fabric here to cut out 4 piece F. And now that this one is small enough for my ruler, I don't even have to pay attention to the lines on the mat. I can just use my ruler to line it up. So for this, I'm gonna line up a straight line around here and then the straight line all the way up. And I'm gonna do that one more time at the same measurement. Now I can stack both of these on top of each other and we'll end up cutting these basically in half to make 4. And then I'm just gonna check the measurement here. So there we go. We have our 4 piece Fs in color 1. So now colors 1, 2, 3, and 4 are already cut out. The final thing to cut is our binding and our background fabric. Next up, we are cutting our background fabric. So you'll see here, I've actually folded the background fabric over. So I've got 2 pieces of the background fabric and they're both folded. So it's 4 layers of fabric here. It's just gonna save a little bit more time as we cut. So I'll start off by just cutting off the excess. And then I'll flip the fabric around. And now I'll cut out the width of fabric strips as it says to do in the pattern. You'll see it says to cut out a few different sizes of strips. So I'm just gonna start where it says to cut 3 of them. And this will be 2 strips and then I'll just have to cut 1 more. And then you just work your way down through the pattern, cutting out all of the width of fabric strips. Once I cut out my width of fabric strips, then I start cutting out the actual pieces. Repeat the same process that we did on the other pieces by cutting off the selvage and then cutting it into the piece sizes. So now I have my 4 piece G, my 4 piece F, my 2 piece C, and my 16 piece E right here. Now I just need to cut the borders. So now for the borders, I'll do the same thing that I did earlier where I have my background fabric folded in half so that I can cut 2 layers at a time. Now I'll just take my border fabrics and set them aside for later. While I'm cutting out pieces for the quilt, I'm also going to go ahead and cut out my binding fabric. This is optional. Some people like to wait until after they have the quilt quilted before they cut their binding strips. But I've got my fabric out now. It's already pressed and ready to go. And I'm gonna use my Stripology ruler. If you don't have a Stripology, if you've never heard of Stripology, let me give you a brief explanation. A Stripology ruler like this one, this is the Stripology XL, which I highly recommend, is a slotted ruler. So every 1/2 inch there is a slot in the ruler that you can put your rotary blade down and they're measured. First off, I have my fabric folded like it comes off the bolt folded and then folded in half again, so it's easy to manage. And I'm gonna use the Stripology ruler to cut my binding strips. So I have my Stripology ruler placed on top of my fabric. I know it's probably a little tough to see, but I'm using one of the lines on the Stripology ruler to make sure it's lined up with the fold in my fabric, and then kind of following the same up at the selvage. And I have my fabric just a little bit off of the 0 mark on the ruler. I'm going to follow the lines on the ruler the entire time, and first I'm going to press down and cut directly on 0. And that'll give us a nice clean starting point. And then I'm going to cut every 2.5 inches for all of my binding strips. And this ruler is amazing because it actually has a little square listed for every 2.5 inch cut. So I just follow the squares. And just like that, I have all of my strips cut out. I didn't have to shift my ruler at all. And then these are all of my strips. You can see I have 8 binding strips cut out. So now I'm just gonna stack these up and save them for when I'm actually ready to bind my quilt. But now I know I have the strips cut out, which gives me some motivation to make sure that I actually get the quilt finished. One thing I love about making the Paradigm quilt is just how quick and easy it is to make and how fast it is to cut out all the pieces. So this is all of the pieces for our quilt top. And the next step that I want to walk you through today is making our corner unit. So go ahead and grab your pattern and flip to the section that says corner units. It'll be kind of snuggled in near the Flying Geese. The reason that we are starting with the corner units instead of working through the way that the pattern is written is simply because the corner units are the easiest part of this quilt. So for the corner units, you're going to grab your 4 color 1 squares and your corresponding 4 background squares. So they should be the same size, both piece F. So grab those. You should have now 8 squares, color 1 and background. And then also go ahead and grab your 4 background piece G. And then we'll set all of our other pieces aside for now. If you want, using sticky notes or paper clips or pieces of paper pinned to your fabric is a good way to kind of keep your pieces straight. So like piece A, B, C, D, etc. Using some sort of tool to help you know which piece is the right shape alphabetically will help throughout the pattern as well. And we have here just pieces F and G. So if you're using solids like I am, it's really easy. You can just make 4 of the same block and rotate them. But if you are using prints, specifically directional prints, you're gonna wanna look at them as if they're already in the quilt. So this is a good opportunity to use that coloring sheet or referencing the diagrams to see where you want the pieces. I have a design wall, so I'm going to show you what it would look like on a design wall. So I'm going to put this here. So we will start off by sewing these 2 squares together, and then we'll sew those 2 squares to this rectangle, which is pretty easy enough. But this would be the bottom left square of the quilt. If we wanted it to be, for instance, the bottom right square, this piece would be here. So we would flip-flop these 2 pieces, just like that. So if we wanted to do the top corners, you'd use the same type of playing around with moving where the blocks are to know where your seams need to be. But since I'm using solids, I can do 4 exactly the same. And when I rotate them, there's not going to be any upside down pieces. So you'll see here I have my squares laid out. I'm going to set these aside for now. I don't need the rectangles until later. And I'll start just by sewing these 2 stacks together. If this is your very first time making a quilt, then definitely use pins. So you'll take your 2 pieces and you'll put them right sides together like this, and then go ahead and grab some pins. I use glass head ones and pin it across. I point the pin towards the seam that I'm going to be sewing, and you can use a few because these are kind of larger pieces, and we can go ahead and do that for all 4. Once your pieces are pinned, you're ready to start sewing. So go ahead and turn on your sewing machine and thread it. I'm using 50 weight cotton thread in both my top needle and my bobbin. And I'm going to use a 2.5 stitch length. This is also a good opportunity to change your needle if you haven't changed your needle in a while. And also make sure that you're using a 1/4 inch presser foot. That 1/4 inch foot is what's going to give you a guide for a perfect 1/4 inch seam. If you want some more tips for getting perfect 1/4 inch seams every time, check out this video linked right here. It'll give you some tips if you're struggling with your 1/4 inch. That's a good place to start. I have this scrap of fabric that I like to start stitching on just to make sure that the threads have somewhere to hold on to. And then from there, I'm going to go ahead and put my needle down, which lifts my presser foot up just a tiny bit. And I can go ahead and put my pieces in through the machine, sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you sew, make sure you take your pins out. The reason I put my pins facing the seam but not all the way up to the line is so that I don't have to stop every time I'm gonna hit a pin. It's not very safe to sew over pins because it can break your needle and send things flying. So I don't recommend sewing over pins. When you're finished sewing all 4 of your pieces together, go ahead and stitch on another scrap of fabric. So what those are leaders and enders, so that would be an ender. And it just holds my threads in place so that I don't have any threads that get lost in the machine, creating little nests on the back of my fabric. Here I am, I've got my wool pressing mat out and a nice hot iron, and I'm going to show you how I press my seams. For these corner units, you don't necessarily have to press the seams open. However, I recommend it. It just is the most flat option for your blocks. So what I do is I go ahead and finger press, and then I come in with my iron. And then we'll hold it there for just a second. If you want your pieces to be extra crisp, you could then flip it over and spray some Best Press on your seam, and then iron that flat again to dry the Best Press. Do all 4 just like that. Once these pieces are pressed, you'll go ahead and grab your piece G rectangles, and we're gonna stitch these to each other. So this is again where you want to be really careful if you're using prints, especially directional prints. But since I'm not, I'm just gonna take it right sides together and make sure that we line it up. And I'm gonna go ahead and pin one right in the center here, like that, and then one at each end. And then I'll repeat that for all 4 corner units. Once you're done pinning, we'll go ahead and stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance on these, and then press the same way that we did these. And once you have cut out all your pieces and made 4 corner units, you are done for week 2 of the Paradigm Sew Along. One question that I get a lot is how to make this quilt using AccuQuilt. So I thought I would show you a little bit about how I would do it. I mentioned last week that the Sprightly quilt pattern is actually written for AccuQuilt. So I recommend grabbing that. I'll go ahead and link it right here for you. The Sprightly quilt pattern uses the same block as Paradigm, but it's written to make larger sizes. The Paradigm pattern does not have AccuQuilt instructions, but it is possible to translate the written instructions using your AccuQuilt dies. So I grabbed my AccuQuilt Go cutting machine, and I grabbed my scraps that I have left over from cutting out my throw size Paradigm quilt, and I'm going to try to use these scraps to make a pillow size using my AccuQuilt machine. So I'm going to follow the Sprightly pattern for this, but also referencing the Paradigm because I'm just making a pillow size Paradigm, which is one Sprightly block with some borders. One really neat thing about the patterns that I write specifically for AccuQuilt, like Sprightly, is that it'll tell you exactly which dies to use to cut it out using AccuQuilt. And that's one thing that I don't have written in the Paradigm pattern, which is why I recommend grabbing this one. I'll be using dies today, all from a cube, which makes it super easy. So I went ahead and pressed my scraps, and I'm gonna start cutting. So as you know, color 1 is all of the squares. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut out my squares using my color 1 leftover fabric. So we've got our big center square and then our 4 corner squares for color 1. Next up, for color 2, we're actually using quarter square triangles when you're using AccuQuilt. And actually, we are using the same die for color 2, 3, and 4. So I'll just go ahead and cut all of those at the same time. So I have colors 1, 2, 3, and 4 cut out for my pillow size, and now I just have to do the background. I hope that this gives you a little bit more confidence in making the Paradigm quilt using your AccuQuilt machine. Throughout the sew along, I'll be sure to show you the piecing instructions if they differ if you're using your AccuQuilt shapes. But for the corner units, it's exactly the same, just squares and rectangles. I am so excited to have AccuQuilt as a sponsor for the sew along. If you missed last week, I will say that we have a grand prize. One lucky winner is going to get their very own AccuQuilt Go machine, just like the machine that I'm using here. Be sure to drop a comment below if there's anything that I left out or any questions that came up for you as you're working on week 2. I'll see you back here next week for week 3 of the Paradigm Quilt Sew Along.